think there's three or four things that I see that are going on. And the first one is much more of a longer term trend, which I think will continue, which is the shift of limit monitoring, of real risk management to the first line from the second line. And I say that because if you go back to the 80s and 90s, you generally had that second line, the risk managers were dictated almost everything, and the first line ran around and complained about them, right? So that was kind of the dynamic that happened. And over time, it really has shifted to a point where it's much more mutual, much more of a discussion about where the business wants to go and where we think the risk management comes in. And what I've seen is now we have in the first line, we have a lot more risk management responsibilities in terms of understanding exactly what we're doing and why, so that the second line becomes a check on what we do as opposed to dictating everything we do. And I say I think it's been a long-term trend, and I see that continuing. So I think also too, the first line can be a little bit more flexible in terms of systems. We've been talking about systems a lot. A lot of the stuff that the second line of defense uses to report and things are those baseline systems that are more difficult to change, where the first line can add some technology to be able to move quickly. So I think that's the first sort of, we'll call it a mega shift, because it's not something that's going to change tomorrow, but it's something that I see happening more and more. I think the second thing that I see changing, and this really is as a result of what we've been through over the last, say 2.5 years, is the need to be able to model the portfolio more quickly. So if I go back, a few 3-4 years ago, it was a fairly stable economic time after the financial crisis. And so we were modeling portfolio, we're modeling scenarios and things, but it was a fairly benign environment. And we probably got a little complacent in terms of being able to change inputs to overall strategic stress tests and things like that. We did them over time. Maybe it was once a year, twice a year. And what we found over the last 2 or 3 years is, especially the last 12 months, we've had to model very different stress tests and scenarios with the portfolio because of the fairly rapidly changing view on the macroeconomic situation. You go back a year ago, I don't think too many people were talking about inflation, or they may have said inflation is a small transitory issue. And now I think everyone believes we just have embedded inflation. So, that's a huge change, especially since we really haven't had too much inflation in the last 20, 30 years. And a lot of the practitioners haven't seen it before. I am old enough, I've seen it before, but a lot of the middle manager people have not. And so that's going to result in us being able to drive, faster changes in modeling and all that for the overall portfolio, and be able to figure out where we think the stress may be coming from. As anyone would know, you look at the economists now and they're kind of frustrated because there are all these different scenarios, and they, obviously somebody's going to be right, but it's difficult to predict. And so because of that, we have to keep modeling different things. I think the last big change, and this is acute, is the whole climate discussion. And there's several pieces of that. I think being a French bank, it's probably been more of a focus for Natixis over the last 5 years than it has for many others. And so at Natixis, we actually have a temperature gauge in our portfolio. And every time we add something to it, it either increases that temperature, i.e. it's a negative, or it reduces that temperature, and we actually have targets based on that temperature. And that temperature is driven by a fairly complex system where we use outsourced vendors to give us information on clients, et cetera. We match that up with what kind of facilities there are. So it's fairly involved because it's been developed over 4 or 5 years. So we actually have a temperature gauge on our portfolio. The second half of that is that we have ratings on each new facility, and that internal capital charge gets higher if that facility is considered more brown. So we have like a brown, a light brown, average, then we have like a green. And so there's 6 different colors in there. I'm not going to go all into it, but we have 6 different covers, but there's actually an internal charge. So it's more expensive to do a deal that's considered brown. And so I think Natixis may be a little bit more ahead of things than a lot of other banks, but I do think banks are going to have to adopt an approach like that. And so that's sort of the second, well, that's the third change, but it has two parts. So that's one part. The other part, and we've heard this from some of the regulators, is climate risk. And I think there's two types of climate risk. One is physical, and most people would say, well, we really don't worry about physical climate risk. Obviously, the heating of the climate is happening over a long period of time, flooding, wildfires, all that stuff. All that stuff should be included in our normal, day-to-day risk management to begin with. So that's really nothing new. What is new, though, is the social aspect of climate change, and reputational risk is heightened because of the awareness of climate in the social field. And so how do we work that into our assessment of risk? Are there some certain companies that are more exposed to that or less? And how do we measure that? How do we develop that? And we've had some inquiries from the regulators that seems like that's something that they want us to look more carefully at. So those are the things we see changing right now. But I think the economy is the biggest one.